Hi guys, I'm in a fix and would like to know everyone's opinion. My name is G, I'm 27, and I have a 7-year-old daughter, Naomi. I was married to my ex-husband, Jack, 30, for almost 8 years. When I was 2 months pregnant with our second child, I found out that my ex-husband was cheating on me with his coworker, Susan, 28. I accidentally came across their text messages on his phone. When I confronted him in tears, Jack finally told me that Susan was also pregnant with his child. Hearing his words, I was so shocked that I almost fainted. My husband and I had several fights, and despite my ex-mother-in-law coming to take care of me during this time, I was so stressed out that I eventually miscarried. When my ex found out that we had lost the child, he didn't even hesitate. Instead of grieving with me or comforting me, he left the house to be with Susan, blaming me for the loss of our child. I was devastated and cried for days. Thankfully, my ex-mother-in-law stayed with me throughout this time and took care of Naomi so I could grieve in peace. Jack and I had a nasty divorce where he refused to pay me child support, but eventually, the court forced him to do so. Throughout the divorce, Jack made it very clear that he didn't want to be involved in either mine or Naomi's lives anymore. He gave up full custody to me, which absolutely broke my heart for my daughter, but there was nothing that I could do. The only thing he has ever done is pay child support every month. He has never made any attempts to visit or get to know Naomi. Eventually, I found out that Susan gave birth to his son, and they have been together ever since. Throughout all of this, my parents and my ex-mother-in-law were there for me each and every day. You see, my ex-mother-in-law and my parents had known each other and had been the best of friends for a very long time. This is how Jack and I first met each other, through our parents, and eventually started dating. When Jack's mom, my ex-mother-in-law, first found out that Jack had cheated on me, she was extremely upset at him and showed her support for me. She and Jack fought a lot regarding his affair, and she vowed to never speak to him again. When she found out that he was leaving me, she also warned him that she wanted nothing to do with his affair partner and their child. I know it's shocking, but my ex-mother-in-law kept that promise until the day she died. She refused to speak to Jack, even when Jack begged her to visit him and his son with his affair partner. Susan was extremely jealous of me and my child because she was never considered family by my ex-mother-in-law. When my ex-mother-in-law first came to support me, she faced a lot of backlash from her family. You see, Jack had lost his father a few years ago, so his relatives tried to convince my ex-mother-in-law to forgive him. They told her that Jack was her son, so she should let bygones be bygones and visit his child. My ex-mother-in-law firmly refused. When Susan gave birth to Jack's child, his relatives rallied around him despite knowing that he had cheated on me. They didn't even bother to care or check on me and my child. Things got so bad between my ex-mother-in-law and her family that they started to exclude her from their celebrations and family events, just so they could invite Jack instead. My ex-mother-in-law always refused to attend events if Jack was going to attend with his affair partner. I always felt bad for my ex-mother-in-law because of this, but she assured me that I was like her child too, and she didn't mind if her relatives dropped her. I am extremely grateful that I had a woman like her as my mother-in-law, because it's rare to be loved and supported this much. Unfortunately, my ex-mother-in-law became unwell, losing her ability to walk and manage on her own. I extended an invitation for her to move in with me permanently, committing to care for her to ensure she had support around the clock. We enlisted the help of a live-in nanny who tended to her needs in the mornings. As for the evenings, the responsibility fell on me. I dedicated countless hours to her care, and honestly, I didn't mind. Naomi, always fond of her grandma, was thrilled to have her living with us. During her stay with us, my ex-mother-in-law revealed something significant. She told me how, when she first learned about Jack leaving me, she had decided to make changes to her will. Initially, she had intended for my ex-husband, being her only child, to inherit everything. However, upon discovering his affair, she had amended the will. Now the house and her life insurance were designated for Naomi. She had also added me in her will to receive a large portion of her money and her family heirloom. It was a gesture that honored and trusted me. Her wish was for me to safeguard these possessions, passing them down to Naomi when the time was right. The idea that a piece of her, and perhaps generations before her, would continue in our family brought a profound sense of connection. I assured my ex-mother-in-law multiple times that she could change the will again if she wanted to include Susan and their child. I emphasized I would never hold a grudge against her, as Susan was his wife now. But my ex-mother-in-law reiterated that she only recognized me as her son's wife, despite our divorce. Hence, she felt Naomi was the rightful inheritor of her home to carry forth the family legacy. I understood where she was coming from, and I accepted her decision. Throughout her stay with me, Jack never bothered to call and ask about her health. Despite our differences, I would have had no issues if he had come to check up on her, but he never cared to do so. One day, my ex-mother-in-law had breathing difficulties, and I had to rush her to the hospital. I was afraid something might happen to her. While my dad took care of Naomi, my mom and I spent the entire night at the hospital praying she would get better. Luckily, she did, and we could take her home. After this health scare, I didn't want my ex-mother-in-law to pass away without Jack even making amends with her. Keeping our differences aside, I called him, begging him to visit her. I told him how her doctor had warned us of her condition, and I was afraid that she wouldn't survive for long. Instead of being concerned for her, Jack started to argue about how his mother had never bothered to form a relationship with Susan. I beseeched him to keep his ego aside for the sake of his mother. He argued that he had a busy schedule and couldn't spare much time. It was disheartening to witness his indifference, especially when faced with the frailty of his mother's health. Despite his reluctance, I persisted, urging him to reconsider and spend some quality time with her. Reluctantly, he agreed to a brief visit. When Jack finally arrived, I was shocked to see that he had brought Susan along with him. I didn't object, although I wasn't thrilled about her coming into my home, but for the sake of my ex-mother-in-law, I kept my mouth shut. When he saw his mother, it was evident that the strained relationship between them lingered. The room was filled with awkward silences, punctuated by forced conversations. Jack's behavior remained unchanged towards her, even when he saw her in this frail state. He spoke in measured tones, avoiding any meaningful conversation with her. It became apparent that his visit was more of a formality than a genuine attempt to mend their fractured bond. Heartened by the lack of emotional connection, I found solace in the fact that, at the very least, Jack had honored his commitment to visit. When my ex-mother-in-law noticed that he had come to visit with Susan and their affair child, she started to protest. I immediately calmed her down and assured her that it was okay, and that I didn't mind whoever Jack brought along, as long as he had come to visit and support her. My ex-mother-in-law's health was fast deteriorating, and she was completely bedbound, so there wasn't much that she could do. Staying true to my promise, I remained silent, even when Susan started being overly nice to her. When my ex-mother-in-law expressed again that she didn't want to be around Darren, Susan reminded her that Darren was her grandchild too. I walked out of the room to give them all privacy. I also wanted to check up on my daughter, who looked sad and hurt to see her father. Jack never even bothered to acknowledge her. While I was in the kitchen, I noticed Susan going into our backyard and talking to someone over the phone. The open window carried her laughter as she spoke about how she was forced to come and visit Jack's mother. She discussed how Jack had told her that his mother would be leaving everything for him, so the least they could do was visit her for the final time. She expressed how she couldn't wait to move into the house and change it, as my ex-mother-in-law had no taste whatsoever. To make matters worse, Susan detailed her intention to remove pictures of me and my daughter once my ex-husband gained ownership of the house. I was shocked to hear this and struggled to comprehend how cruel she sounded. She continued to discuss how she was going to change the furniture, repaint the walls, and even alter the landscape of the backyard so that nothing would remain of my ex-mother-in-law. As she enthusiastically shared her vision, I couldn't help but feel a sense of disbelief and anger at her disregard for the home's history. That is when I finally realized the truth. Susan's interest in my ex-mother-in-law wasn't genuine. It became clear that her motives were centered around securing her position in the will. This discovery shattered my heart, as it seemed she cared more about potential inheritance than the well-being of my ex-mother-in-law during her final days. Despite the unsettling truth about Susan's intentions, I kept the knowledge to myself, choosing not to hurt or add unnecessary burden to my ex-mother-in-law. Jack had no clue that his mother had changed her will after he cheated on me, and we got divorced. He believed he would inherit everything, intending to pass it on to his child with Susan. I chose not to tell him anything because it wasn't my place. If he didn't even bother to acknowledge our daughter, Naomi, then he deserved what was coming to him. Jack and Susan continued their visit, oblivious to this fact. It was a bittersweet situation for me. On one hand, I dreaded losing my beloved ex-mother-in-law, who had always meant so much to me. On the other hand, I couldn't wait to see the look on Jack's face when he found out about the updated will. I knew my ex-mother-in-law had made this decision after careful consideration. She wanted to ensure Naomi felt loved and cherished, even when she was no longer here. Her own childhood had been ruined when her father had an affair, and she was determined to protect Naomi from the same pain. As my ex-mother-in-law's health declined, Jack never visited her again, and none of her relatives came to see her. Unfortunately, she passed away last week. In the wake of her passing, I took charge of organizing her funeral, despite the lack of support from her relatives. My parents and I made all the arrangements, ensuring she received a dignified farewell. Susan didn't even bother attending the funeral with Jack. Although some of her relatives came, they displayed a lack of genuine concern. When her lawyer contacted me about her will, I was overwhelmed with emotions. Tears streamed down my face as I learned that she had left everything to me, just as we had discussed. A mix of joy and sadness engulfed me. I grieved the loss of a cherished person, but felt grateful that I could finally provide for my daughter in ways I never imagined. One day there was a sudden knock on my door. Opening it, I found Jack, Susan, Darren, and a few other relatives standing there with grim expressions. Jack asked if they could come in, and I politely agreed. The atmosphere was tense as they entered. Jack wasted no time demanding an explanation for the will. His accusing tone was filled with resentment. "Why did you get everything? My mother's house, money, heirlooms. You end up with it all," he exclaimed, his anger palpable. I tried to remain composed, explaining that my ex-mother-in-law had carefully considered her decision. Jack accused me of manipulating her while she was bedridden, but I reiterated that he could check the date and timestamp of the updated will, which was made long before her health began to decline. Susan chimed in, her voice tinged with resentment. "Why do you and your daughter deserve everything, while we, her family, are left with nothing?" I scoffed, revealing what I had overheard Susan saying on the phone. Her eyes widened as she realized I remembered her exact words. Jack looked at her in surprise, as the reality of Susan's intentions dawned on him. Caught off guard, Susan attempted to deny my claims, accusing me of making things up to divide the family. I firmly reminded them that Susan and Jack were the ones who had already divided the family by having an affair. The argument escalated as Jack's relatives joined in, expressing their disappointment over being left out of the will. They insisted I sell the property and split the proceeds 8 ways. Their entitlement shocked me. I emphasized that I had been the only one taking care of my ex-mother-in-law until her last days, while none of them had even bothered to visit. Jack protested, claiming it was his childhood home and that he deserved to live there with Susan and their child. He threatened to sue me if I didn't give him the house. I laughed in his face and reminded him that he had been a neglectful son who never checked on his mother unless I begged him to. "You're welcome to sue me if you want to waste your money," I told him. "The will is ironclad. Naomi is her grandchild, and I was her daughter-in-law who cared for her. She made her decision, and there's nothing you can do about it." Susan began begging, urging me to consider their child, Darren. She claimed he deserved a good life like Naomi. I agreed, but questioned whether she ever cared about my daughter. I made it clear that I wasn't going to give her or her child anything. I asked everyone to leave, reminding them they could consult the lawyer if they wanted. Since then, Jack has continued to call and message me, expressing his disdain and insisting I hand over everything. But I refused to back down. My ex-mother-in-law's decision was hers alone, and I will honor it. As for those criticizing me for not including Jack's new child and Susan in the will, I did try, but my ex-mother-in-law made her choice. She had plenty of time to change her will if she wanted to. My priority is my daughter Naomi and ensuring her future. Jack still has his father's art collection, which is worth thousands of dollars. He can take care of Susan and their child with that. My ex-mother-in-law didn't want her son's actions to go unpunished, and I'm determined to respect her wishes. We've moved into her house now, and it's bittersweet. I miss her presence deeply, but I find solace in knowing that her home will continue to be a haven for Naomi. I carry her spirit with me, grateful for the time we had together and the legacy she left behind.